Hello. Welcome back to Textory. If you don't know what's going on, my name is Karolina Żebrowska. I am primarily a YouTuber, but this is my podcast. And in Textory, we read interesting historical texts and react to them. The texts I choose are usually some juicy historical letters, diaries, interesting articles, just anything that I find interesting. And I think it would be interesting to dissect it and really delve into why they wrote it and what context was this written in. So this is what the podcast is all about. Another thing I want to introduce you guys to is that I currently have a Patreon set up for Textory. So far, Textory does not have any sponsors. That might change in the future, but so far I'm doing this basically for free, if not even losing money. So it will be nice to not have to do that. So if you want to support Textory in any way, head over to patreon.com/Textory. The lowest tier is $5, which I think is pretty affordable. If you want to help out and make sure that Textory is alive and kicking and keeps going and new episodes appear, head over to my Patreon to help out. And that's it. Now let's jump into this episode. Today, we are delving into the magical and mysterious world of fairies. Magical and mysterious, but also really silly, I have to say. It was a story that shook the world, or at least Britain, in the 1920s. You may be familiar with the case of Cottingley fairies. Now, this is such an interesting case for me because once you see the photographs, it's really difficult to understand what the big deal was and why did everyone become obsessed with these really poorly done photographs. Let's rewind. Let's go to the beginning. In 1917, in the Yorkshire town of Cottingley, two teenagers, Elsie and Frances, who are cousins, they ask Elsie's dad for a camera because they want to photograph fairies and gnomes and some other fantastical creatures that they regularly play with. So Elsie's father is like, "Oh, yeah, sure you can. That's so sweet." And he gives them the camera, and sure enough, they return him the plates. He develops the plates, and he discovers there are indeed fairies in the photographs. Now, because he owns a photography studio that Elsie, which was the older cousin, she was 16 at the time. So she spends a lot of time with him in the photography studio, and he just assumes that she just had to manipulate the photo in some way. But his wife is like, no, there is no way. This has got to be real. And his wife was probably the first person that started this whole craze, because if she just ignored it, it would never even see the light of day. Either way, he doesn't tell the media, he doesn't tell the authorities, he doesn't contact anyone, and the photographs remain in the household. In 1919, Elsie's mom is like, no, I have to do something about this. This is insane. So she is also very much into theosophy, which was at the time an esoteric movement. So all sorts of spiritual things going on. She attends a lecture on fairies. It's insane to me that they had genuine lectures on fairies at the time and nobody batted an eye. They were just there's this fairy lecture I'm going to this afternoon. Anyway, she goes to that lecture. She shows the photographs to the local Theosophical Society. And it is through William Gardner that those photographs finally reach none other than Arthur Conan Doyle. So the writer responsible for the creation of Sherlock Holmes. And he's around 60 at the time. He considers himself a spiritualist. He believes a lot of weird stuff. And he is absolutely fascinated with the photographs. He writes an article about the case for the Strand magazine. And then he's like, no, that's not enough. So in 1922, he publishes a whole book called The Coming of the Fairies. And this is the book which we'll be reading today. This book contains reproductions of the famous Cottingley photographs and gives the whole of evidence in connection with them. The diligent reader is in almost as good a position as I am to form a judgment upon the authenticity of the pictures. This narrative is not a special plea for that authenticity, but is simply a collection of facts, the inferences from which may be accepted or rejected as the reader may think fit. I would warn the critic, however, not to be led away by the sophistry that because some professional trickster apt at the game of deception can produce a somewhat similar effect, therefore the originals were produced in the same way. I find it interesting that straight from the beginning he's like, I know some guys can create like literally the same effect, but that doesn't mean that it's not real. It just means that they're really good at imitating the actual fairies. I would add that this whole subject of the objective existence of a subhuman form of life has nothing to do with the larger and far more vital question of spiritualism. I should be sorry if my arguments in favor of the latter should be in any way weakened by my exposition of this very strange episode, which has really no bearing upon the continued existence of the individual. It has to be said, like, if he was into spiritualism, he really does not show it in the book because he's trying to keep it as neutral as possible. He focuses on, like, the idea of the existence of the fairies. He's not, like, delving into spiritualism in this one. The series of incidents set forth in this little volume represent either the most elaborate and ingenious hoax ever played upon the public, or else they constitute an event in human history which may in the future appear to have been epoch-making in its character. Boy, do I have news for you, like you could have stopped right there. To be fair though, it did take them a while to uncover this as a hoax. He probably would not ever live to actually find a solution to this mystery. It is hard for the mind to grasp what the ultimate results may be if we have actually proved the existence upon the surface of this planet of a population which may be as numerous as the human race, which pursues its own strange life in its own strange way, and which is only separated from ourselves by some difference of vibrations. So he originally actually got in touch with William Gardner's sister, and he quotes a letter from her about the photographs. This is a quote from the letter. I wish you could see a photo he has. He believes in fairies, pixies, goblins, etc. Children, in many cases, really see them and play with them. He has got into touch with a family in Bradford, where the little girl, Elsie, and her cousin, Frances, constantly go into woods and play with the fairies. The father and mother are skeptical and have no sympathy with their nonsense, as they call it. But an aunt, whom Edward has interviewed, is quite sympathetic with the girls. Some little time ago, Elsie said she wanted to photograph them and begged her father to lend his camera. For long he refused, but at least she managed to get the loan of it and one plate. Off she and Frances went into the woods near a waterfall. Frances ticed them, as they call it, and Elsie stood ready with the camera. Soon, the three fairies appeared, and one pixie dancing in Frances's aura. Elsie snapped and hoped for the best. It was a long time before the father would develop the photo, but at last he did, and to his utter amazement, the four sweet little figures came out beautifully. Edward got the negative and took it to a specialist in photography who would know a fake at once. Skeptical as he was before he tested it, afterwards he offered £100 down for it. I'm assuming at the time it was like a decent amount of money. He pronounced it absolutely genuine and a perfectly remarkable photograph. This is something that I find really interesting. Like, I know that the technology back then was not that developed, and I know that it was more difficult for people to tell what sort of manipulations have been done with the photographs. However, if you are a specialist in photography, how come you would not see what is up with the photo? Like, I'm assuming he was looking for like actual manipulation when it comes to the negative, and because it was not done on the negative, he didn't find anything. But still, saying it's an absolutely genuine and a perfectly remarkable photograph, I would not use his services in photography. Edward has it enlarged and hanging in his hall. He is very interested in it, and as soon as possible, he is going to Bradford to see the children. What do you think of this? Edward says the fairies are on the same line of evolution as the winged insects, etc., etc. That's very interesting that they're already thinking about like the scientifical side of it. Where do fairies come from, evolutionary wise? How did they develop? Which animal kingdom do they belong in? All these really rational questions when faced with a very irrational phenomenon. So Arthur Conan Doyle was like, no, that's it. I need to see the photographs. So he asked for the photographs, and this is his description of them. This letter enclosed the two very remarkable photographs, which are reproduced in this volume, that which depicted the dancing goblin, and the other of wood elves in a ring. An explanatory note setting forth the main points of each is appended to their productions. I was naturally delighted at the wonderful pictures and wrote back thanking Miss Blomfield for her courtesy and suggesting that an inquiry should be set on foot which would satisfy me as to the genuine nature of the photographs. If this were clearly established, I hoped that I might be privileged to help Mr. Gardner in giving publicity to the discovery. So Arthur Conan Doyle was already thinking like, okay, I'm kind of famous. If I bring attention to this, it's going to be a really big deal. And he wanted it to be a big deal because, like, imagine genuinely believing that fairies are suddenly discovered. I would shit my pants. I would be so excited if someone had proof of the existence of the fairies. I would be absolutely ecstatic. So I completely understand where he's coming from, if he genuinely believed the photos to be genuine. So then he was corresponding with Mr. Gardner, and this is one of the replies from Mr. Gardner to Arthur Conan Doyle. This was in 1920, by the way. Dear Sir, your interesting letter of the 22nd has just reached me, and very willingly I will assist you in any way that may be possible. With regard to the photographs, the story is rather a long one, and I have only gathered it by going very carefully. The children who are concerned are very shy and reserved indeed. They are of a mechanic's family in Yorkshire, and the children are said to have played with fairies and elves in the woods near their village since babyhood. I will not attempt to narrate this story here, however. Perhaps we may meet for that. But when I at length obtained a view of the rather poor prints, it so impressed me I begged for the actual negatives. These I submitted to two first-class photographic experts, one in London and one in Leeds. The first, who was unfamiliar with such matters, declared the plates to be perfectly genuine and unfaked, but inexplicable. The second, who did know something of the subject and had been instrumental in exposing several psychic fakes, was also entirely satisfied. It's interesting that he mentions the psychic fakes because there's a lot of photographs from the 20s where it's supposedly like, oh, I photographed someone's aura, or oh, it's a plasma, this appearance next to this person, but it's like clearly a picture of a sheet, just like imposed on the original negative. So it's like double exposure. And I'm assuming someone that specialized in debunking all those psychic style photographs was probably looking for changes in the negatives. And it's possible that the girls' photographs did not have any changes in the negatives because all was done in camera in like real time. So I'll cut him some slack. Hence I proceeded. I am hopeful of getting more photographs, but the immediate difficulty is to arrange for the two girls to be together. They are 16 or 17 years old and beginning to work and are separated by a few miles. It may be we can manage it and thus secure photographs of the other varieties besides those obtained. These nature spirits are of the non-individualized order, and I should greatly like to secure some of the higher. But two children such as these are rare, and I fear now that we are late, because almost certainly the inevitable will shortly happen. One of them will fall in love, and then, hey presto. This is the end of the letter by Edward Gardner. By the way, I think I referred to him as William Gardner a couple of times in this episode so far, but it's Edward. Anyway, it's so typical that as soon as you find a person or people that have some supernatural abilities or just seem exciting and are worthy of studying in a scientific way, you want to make them your subject. So he's like, oh no, what if they fall in love and they're not going to want to cooperate and we won't get any more photographs? What if they want to fall in love? What if they want to live in a village? What if they're done with fairies for now? But it's so typical that there is supposed to be this like subject to study. So Arthur Conan Doyle goes on to explain how he was trying to get some second opinions from other people. In the meantime, I showed the positives and sometimes the negatives to several friends whose opinion upon psychic matters I respected. Of these, Sir Oliver Lodge holds a premier place. I can still see his astonished and interested face as he gazed at the pictures, which I placed before him in the hall of the Athenaeum Club. With his usual caution, he refused to accept them at their face value, and suggested the theory that the Californian classical dancers had been taken and their picture superimposed upon a rural British background. That's a really good theory, like that would be my first thought as well. I argued that we had certainly traced the pictures to two children of the artisan class, and that such photographic tricks would be entirely beyond them. But I failed to convince him, nor am I sure that even now he is wholehearted in the matter, not Arthur Conan Doyle calling out his friend in his book and being like, I don't actually think he still believes me, but bless his heart. Then he got another letter from Mr. Gardner, where Mr. Gardner is telling him about the latest developments when it comes to trying to get someone to approve the photographs in like a technical way. So they contacted Kodak, which made the film, and Illingworth Company. However, Mr. Gardner writes, the Kodak people and also the Illingworth Company are unwilling to testify. The former, of course, you know of. Illingworth's claim that they could produce by means of clever studio painting and modeling a similar negative. So they were just like, we don't think it's real, and we think that it's really simple to just copy this using the means that we possess. Another company's experts made assertions concerning the construction of the model that I found were entirely erroneous directly I saw the real ground. They, however, barred any publication. The net result, besides Snelling's views, Snelling is another person that they asked for an opinion, is that the photograph could be produced by studio work, but there is no evidence positively of such work in the negatives. He also gives his impression of Elsie's father, Arthur Wright. The father, Mr. Arthur Wright, impressed me favorably. He was perfectly open and free about the whole matter. He explained his position. He simply did not understand the business, but is quite clear and positive that the plate he took out of the Midge camera is the type of the camera that they used, was the one he put in the same day. His work is that of electrician to an estate in the neighborhood near. He is clear-headed and very intelligent, and gives one the impression of being open and honest. I do find it very interesting that he instantly thought that the girls have manipulated the photographs, but when people started getting interested in the photographs, he was like, what if I can profit off this? Because like deep inside, he probably knew that there's no way these are real, knowing that he also has like a photo studio, that she was familiar with how photography works. I don't think he was like a genuine fairy believer. Okay, this is hilarious. So Arthur Conan Doyle has a whole chapter describing like different kinds of fairies and how they look and like their physical appearance and what we've heard so far from different sources. And this is too funny. So he's basically like quoting people that have witnessed fairies. And this is something that he like genuinely ponders on, like it's a genuine concern of his how this is even possible, and this is what I'm talking about. The little fairy horses are mentioned by several writers, And yet it must be admitted that their presence makes the whole situation far more complicated and difficult to understand. If horses, why not dogs? So the guy is like, oh my god, do we genuinely have like miniature horses? And if they do have horses, do they also have like tiny chickens? Like, this is serious, scientifically based essay of his where he's like actually considering this. And we find ourselves in a whole new world upon the fairy scale. I have convinced myself that there is overwhelming evidence for the fairies, but I have by no means been able to assure myself of these adjuncts. So he is a little skeptical of the fairy horses. He's like, if it's true, we're in for a treat because there is a world of little animals that awaits. But if it's fake, it smells like hoax to me. Then he also tries to describe how fairies function. He's like, how do they move? I'm pretty sure he's drawing from his like spiritualist knowledge and experience in this, because the language that he's using is very much in that sort, but it's still hilarious to me that it's a serious book. It's not a laughing matter, but the way he writes is just so... Basically, he says, fairies use bodies of a density that we should describe in non-technical language as of a lighter than gaseous nature. But we should be entirely wrong if we thought them in consequence unsubstantial. In their own way, they are as real as we are, and perform functions in connections with plant life of an important and most fascinating character. So this is also something that gets me. They're speculating in terms of how nature works and what we know about nature. How do fairies fit into that? Because they already know that everything in nature is like, has a purpose. So like, what's the purpose of the fairies? To hint at one phase, many a reader will have remarked on the lasting freshness and beauty of flowers cut and tended by one person, and on the other hand, their comparatively short life when in the care of another. So his theory is basically that fairies take care of plants, I think. Then he also ponders on some mundane aspects of fairy life. So he's like, what do they eat? And his answer is, there is no food taken as we should regard it. Nourishment, usually abundant and ample for sustenance, is absorbed directly by a rhythmic breathing or pulse. Resource to the magnetic bath on occasion appears to be their only special restorative. My question is like, how does he know all that? Because it's one thing to hear a story from someone that's like, I saw a fairy near the waterfall. It's another to be like, yeah, I think they use rhythmic breathing or pulse for absorbing nourishment. It's like, this has got to be his own theory. The perfume of flowers is delighted in, and reversely, disagreeable odors repel. This is one of many reasons, besides timidity, why human society is usually avoided, there being little that is inviting in that connection for them, and much that is obnoxious. So he's basically like, if you've never seen a fairy, and if you're wondering why we never see fairies, it's basically because we as humans stank, and they don't want to have anything to do with us because the odor is just too unpleasant. Okay, this is actually probably the most insane part of the book for me, and it's called Birth, Death, and Sex. We had fairy porn in 1922. Any estimate of length of life is misleading, because comparison with ourselves cannot be made. There is no real birth nor death, as we understand the terms. Simply a gradual emergence from and return to a subtler state of being. This process takes some time, probably years in certain varieties, and their life on the denser level, corresponding to our adult period, may be as long as the average human. There is nothing definite in all this, however, except the fact of the gradual emergence and return. Okay, listen. There is no sex as we should regard it. Though, so far as I can gather, what is that supposed to mean? So far as I can gather? It's not like you've been observing fairies in the zoo. Anyway, so far as I can gather, there is division and subdivision of body at a much subtler and earlier level than that usually sensed. This process seems to correspond to the fission and budding of our familiar simple animalcules, with the addition towards the end of the cycle of fusion or reassembly into the larger unit. I have exactly zero idea what the hell he's talking about. Like, I don't understand anything what he's saying. I don't even know if he's referring to sex as a gender or sex as in how do they reproduce, because I genuinely don't understand anything. And I think that probably was his point also, to like not get into details, because then he would get asked questions. Anyway, the other chapter is called The Future, which is like what they think could happen if fairies are real in the future. What might follow an intelligent understanding of the little people and the establishment of mutual good feeling opens up a prospect alluring in the extreme. It would be for us a working in the light instead of in darkness. A foretaste of such cooperation may be gathered by noting the effect of a devoted lover of flowers on his or her charges. The nature spirit responds to emotion and appears keenly appreciative of kindly attention and affection. Whether this applies with any force to any but the varieties concerned with flowers and fruits, I cannot say, but it certainly does to them. And the intelligent direction of effort in place of empirical incident tempts one's speculation to run riot as to future possibilities. Again, I genuinely don't know what the hell he's talking about. I'm actually not sure. Anyway, this is the final note that he gives in the book, regardless the whole thing, the whole affair. I have now laid before the reader the full circumstances in connection with the 5 successful photographs taken at Cottingley. I have added the experience of clairvoyant officer in the company of the girls upon the 3rd and unsuccessful attempt to get photographs. I have analyzed some of the criticism which we have had to meet. I have given the reader the opportunity of judging the evidence for a considerable number of alleged cases collected before and after the Cottingley incident. I love how he refers to it as the Cottingley incident because it sounds so dramatic. Finally, I have placed before him the general theory of the place in creation of such creatures, as defined by the only system of thought which has found room for them. Having read and weighed all this, the investigator is in as strong a position as Mr. Gardner or myself, and each must give his own verdict. I do not myself contend that the proof is as overwhelming as in the case of spiritualistic phenomena. That's interesting. So he's like, there is a lot of proof for the fairies. I have just described how they eat and how they function. However, I still consider it less believable than spiritualism, which is like my main belief. We cannot call upon the brightest brains in the scientific world, the Crooks, the Lodges, or the Lombrosos, for confirmation. But that may also come, and for the present, while more evidence will be welcome, there is enough already available to convince any reasonable man that the matter is not one which can be readily dismissed, but that a case actually exists, which up to now has not been shaken in the least degree by any of the criticism directed against it. Far from being resented, such criticism, so long as it's earnest and honest, must be most welcome to those whose only aim is the fearless search for truth. That's very humble to be like, we welcome any criticism because it actually helps us to get closer to the truth. Very cute, very demure. Fast forward, the matter kind of died out. There were only 5 photographs and no new photographs appeared. The girls sort of distanced themselves from the whole drama. They were just like so tired of the whole drama. They said years later that the whole thing blowing up was just like completely unintended and they did not enjoy it at all because they kept getting asked questions and stuff. So what really happened? How did the photographs get made? Like what happened? So basically, Elsie and Frances were just like playing around. So they had a book called Princess Mary's Gift Book. And it had an illustration of dancing girls. And Elsie, the older one, just copied the illustrations of the dancing girls and turned them into fairies, like she drew wings on them. And they cut out the cardboard figures and they supported them with hat pins to stay in place. So this is basically what happened. And they just did it for fun. They just thought it's going to be fun. However, the more they went into it, the more they were just like, you know how kids are sometimes. They just stick to it. So they just kind of stuck to it. And the whole thing blowing up was like the worst thing that could happen to them, basically. So years later, in 1983, was the first time that they admitted to faking the photographs. But they have, what is interesting, both maintained that they have seen real fairies. I don't know what they said that for. Like, if everyone already knows that the photographs are fake, it's this like last attempt at dignity, basically, to be like, but I did see them though. And it's interesting because while Elsie confessed to all the photographs being fake, Frances claimed that the very last photograph that they took, the fifth one, was genuine, was real. She said that they were just like playing around and they saw the fairies and they took the picture. And they both claimed to have taken the picture. Why would she say that? I don't know. The picture is clearly made in the same way that the other ones are. Maybe it's a little bit more blurry, maybe like double exposure. But either way, like it's clear that it's, I mean, be for real right now. It's like cardboard cutouts. But it's interesting that she still claimed that no, the last one was actually real. But Elsie said that the truth is that they were just a little too embarrassed to admit to the truth because they fooled Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm not sure if that was the actual reason. They probably just wanted to just let it go and focus on their lives. But it might be that this is why Frances kind of stuck to her theory and was like, no, we actually did see fairies and the last one is genuine, because she did not want to be considered like the fraudster that tricked Arthur Conan Doyle into something that he probably believed until he passed away. Which is low-key funny because they were, at the time of the taking of the pictures, they were 16 and 9. So tiny girls, really young, sweet girls that were just like playing around. Anyway, this is all for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this. Not gonna lie, it would be lit if it was true. Those are really cute photographs. And they actually went up for an auction not that long ago, I think in like 2000s. And they were really cheap. They went for like thousands of pounds, which like back then it was probably more money than it is now, but still, like I would expect it to be like hundreds of thousands of pounds. So like, who got the Cottingley fairy pictures? I need to know because, oh my God, I really want one. Like the original photographs, so cute. Anyway, yeah, this was the story of how two little girls tricked Arthur Conan Doyle into believing that fairies exist. So hope you guys enjoyed this one. Don't forget to check out my Patreon at patreon.com/textree, and I'll hear you in another episode. Bye!